Migrant children are being forced to work illegally in the United States while the government looks the other way. Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo and this is The Heat. They are driven to the United States by violence and extreme poverty in their home countries. But once they get into the United States, thousands of immigrant children are being forced to work in illegal and often dangerous circumstances. When unaccompanied minors arrive at the U.S. border, they're sent to shelters and then released to live with sponsors while they await the immigration process. Those sponsors are usually family members, but are also sometimes strangers. A growing number of these unaccompanied children put pressure on the Biden administration to clear them from shelters fast.
I believe that we will win.
The result, according to some reports, has been placement without proper vetting. A New York Times investigation found many children end up being abused, forced into illegal child labor, working to pay rent and fees to unscrupulous sponsors. Caseworkers interviewed by the newspaper said this scenario is an open secret and, more disturbing, a business for some sponsors. They tell of individuals housing more than a dozen teenage migrants, forcing them to work and taking a chunk of their earnings. Washington, meanwhile, has trouble keeping track of these kids. Data obtained by the New York Times showed that over the last 2 years, government officials could not reach more than 85,000 children. A government hotline to help such kids is also proving insufficient, with the Times reporting that some children who call the line for help never hear back from authorities or see any police intervention. There is a lot to discuss. Let's bring in our panelists. From Eagleville in Tennessee, Alan Orr is an attorney and former president of the American Immigration Lawyers Association. Joseph Williams is a former senior editor for U.S. News and World Report. He joins us right here in Washington, D.C. Also here with us in D.C., Brian Becker is the executive director of the Answer Coalition. Thank you, everyone, for being with us. Brian, we have children who get to the southern border of the United States, request asylum and are sent to shelters. Then they end up with sponsors who abuse and exploit them. They end up in factories where they work for very little. They work very long hours, and many of these factories, of course, supply goods to other big corporations in the United States. And there's even speculation right now that the Biden administration may reopen those immigration detention centers. The United States Secretary for Health and Human Services said that children should be released faster than an assembly line. A bad choice of words there, but what can you tell us about this situation?
There are multiple factors at play at creating this new scourge of childhood exploitation. It's really awful. It's clearly a violation of the 1938 Fair Labor Standards Act that really started the policing of child labor in a different way in the United States. The scourge of child labor and child exploitation is not a new thing, but it's starting to come back in big ways. It's not only the problem of sponsors, and it's not only the problem of the quick release or the lack of a quick release for young people who are detained, or the fact that there's this legion, this army that you reported in your beginning, 85,000 kids who are unaccounted for. Another factor is state legislatures, for instance, Minnesota and Iowa, are passing legislation to make it legal to employ child labor in ways that was considered unimaginable before. And one of the issues right now is that there is a labor shortage. Jerome Powell, the chairman of the Federal Reserve, said that as many as this was not really revealed very publicly or very loudly at least, 500,000 workers died during COVID when 1.1 million Americans died. Many of them were older workers. They need to be replaced. Many other older workers, out of fear of getting sick, stopped working. So as older workers either died because of COVID or left the workforce, corporations are deliberately calculating, trying to get made-up workers who can take their place. And they're reverting to child labor, and especially to immigrant child labor. And this is the disgrace. You have the politicians of both parties saying, we don't want any more immigrants. They can't come in, demonizing them, using all sorts of racist tropes against immigrants. And yet child labor, child immigrants being super exploited by the same U.S. corporations who then go around the world telling everybody else we are the bastion of freedom. Terrible.
Brian, you know, you were saying that there are some states which want to pass legislation which would make it legal to employ children, but there are exceptions even to the older laws, aren't there? Because United States farmers have been using child labor for a long time.
Yes, there are many carve-outs from the 1938 bill. I mean, the 1938 bill, while it provided generalized protection for childhood labor, because of race, the issues of race, especially because of the agricultural sector largely uncovered in the South, that was young black people who were still working in cotton and tobacco fields. The farm workers in the West, largely people from Latin America, many from the Caribbean, and also many from Mexico. So there are these big carve-outs, and if you also take another part of the issue, parents can employ children in ways that also they're exempted from some of these same labor protections too, and that's actually not a small element. But there's lots of child labor. It's okay to work if you're 14 or 15 or 16 under some circumstances. I worked when I was 14, but these are conditions where there's super exploitation, terrible working conditions, violations of the 1938 law, and clearly criminal conduct on the part of corporate America, where the politicians either look the other way or are actually conniving to help this process go forward.
Okay, joining us now from Phoenix, Arizona is Rafael Carranza. He is a reporter covering immigration for the Arizona Republic. Rafael, great to see you. Thanks for being with us. We're talking about child labor in the United States. The New York Times published a report and said that migrant children are being exploited in the United States, doing some of the most punishing jobs. What have you seen covering immigration?
Well, you know, certainly I think what we've seen is that the conditions that are existing along the border create some of these situations. And I think that there's been a big emphasis in ensuring that the way that you know, the children, once they make it into the United States, that they are placed with sponsors and that they do so in a way that it will be, you know, with individuals that will be caring for them. And so as a result of that investigation, you know, the Departments of Labor and Health and Human Services announced steps that they would be taking to ensure that, you know, this would happen. For example, you know, they announced the creation of a task force that would allow, you know, the federal government to communicate, because when we're talking about kids, the way that the U.S. system is set up, you know, there's different responsibilities that fall within different departments within the federal government. And so it's really a disparate approach. It's not concentrated into one single agency. And sometimes that makes it a bit harder to communicate with each other. So this task force, I think, is going to be aiming to do more of that. But, you know, they're also announcing, for example, that the Department of Health and Human Services, which take care of unaccompanied minors, they're announcing, you know, plans to follow up with, you know, children after they've been placed with sponsors to ensure that, for example, they're enrolled in school, that they have access to medical and mental health services, and, you know, again, ensuring that, you know, they're being placed, you know, with individuals that will be caring for them, as opposed, you know, to take advantage of the fact that they're being brought into the country. But I will also add that, you know, I think that the way that the system is set up also makes it a bit difficult, because a lot of times many of these families, whether they're, you know, the parents and the children traveling together or just the child alone, you know, a lot of times they'll go into heavy debt to be able to get to the United States. And so once they reach here, they're under immense pressure to be able to repay that debt, or in many instances also to provide for their family back home. And so that sort of incentivizes them to do some of these jobs or look for ways to make money. And even when they're traveling with their parents or relatives, many instances when they make it to the United States, they're unable to work legally because they don't have access to a work permit until about 6 to 12 months after they arrive. And so then that also sort of creates the conditions where not just the parents, but also the children could potentially, you know, be pressured or feel that pressure to provide. But, you know, there's certainly a lot of attention that's receiving now. And I think one of the component that I think is important to talk about here is that, you know, these are companies that are taking advantage of this. And so, you know, for example, the Department of Labor is calling on Congress to increase the penalties that, you know, companies could face if they do employ children.
Alan Orr, great to have you with us. Welcome to the show. I want to get back to the companies that use these children as labor. Some of the children cited in that New York Times report work for companies that supply major American corporations like Walmart, like Target. These are big retailers in the United States. What kind of legal protections do these children have, or are they in some kind of legal limbo?
So I think they are in a legal limbo, and I think it's important to sort of talk about all of this together, because I think part of the problem is that you need to see something and say something, whether you be the corporation, the person working at the company, the person in the community seeing this sort of thing happen, because the United States government just can't be everywhere. So I think we all have a responsibility to sort of meet this need. Part of meeting that need is congressional immigration reform, because these individuals, these children would not be separated from their families, but in case of not being able for the whole family unit to come to the United States. Because we have a rule right now where we won't turn away unaccompanied children at the border. And then in the last administration, we had childhood separation. So all of those things are important factors. It's also important to know that these corporations are sort of hiding behind this thing of saying they're using staffing companies. So these individuals weren't directly employed by the companies. They were through staffing companies, which is very popular now in the United States because of the job shortage that you sort of spoke about, that could be met by, once again, immigration reform. And the thing about the children who are here, who are migrants, who might have language challenges, they don't have representation, so they're not aware of their rights. They're not aware of the responsibilities, and that's a legal failing of the system. And part of what should be happening in these facilities is to make sure they're aware of what their rights are within the United States and who they need to contact within the different regions. Because besides the federal government, there are state governments and local governments that have laws with regards to the way these children are being basically worked.
And Alan, these staffing companies that you talk about that basically are the source of labor for these big companies, can they be held accountable?
They have been held accountable. One of the things that I will say the Department of Justice has been doing a good job of is going after all of these sort of back world labor markets of either discrimination or employing large children. So the Department of Justice is sort of catching up the realm of that. But sort of think about the size of the Department of Justice compared to all these companies, compared to all these job shortages. And part of what we know is that if the companies could get the employees they needed because of immigration or some other reform that would allow them to have the workers there, they would not sort of do this sort of situation with small children. I would hope. I haven't seen that in the past. But once again, we're talking about slaughterhouses, cleaning facilities, and nighttime working. But it's an education on both parts. And I think finding these companies is always something that I think is an interesting thing, because when the companies find, the responsibility just goes back to us as the buyer of the products. We absorb that by paying for that fine. We need to see more criminal reaction with regards to this, with people going to jail, and that will deter a lot of this behavior.
Joseph, Alan was talking a moment ago about the need for comprehensive immigration reform, and we've talked about this so many times on the show. Many politicians talk about immigration reform, and there are some who say, look, it's not going to happen because it doesn't play well with the domestic constituency here in the United States. Any kind of immigration reform is seen as a vote loser. So where are we in terms of sort of closing the loopholes that we are seeing where it concerns children?
Well, Groundhog Day was last month, but when it comes to immigration reform, it seems like it's perpetual. We always have the Republicans accusing the Democrats of open borders, the Democrats accusing the Republicans of being heartless, when the reality is that both parties bear some responsibility here. I mean, certainly you have President Biden, who advocated a more humane process of immigration after President Donald Trump was turning away entire families and putting people in detention centers. Really bad visuals for the Republican Party, and in part one of the reasons why Biden prevailed. Now, Biden is talking about going back to some, he held Trump policies in place mainly because the courts had tied his hands. But now that he's president, he is talking about retaining retaining the ability to attend unauthorized migrants to the United States. And really, we have this perpetual problem when, if you pull back the camera even further and talk a little bit less about the squabbles that we always have here in the United States over immigration, and talk about the reasons why these migrants are surging towards the U.S. border, it's a problem and part of the United States' own creation. Back in the 80s, when we started deporting people who were born in the United States, who were not U.S. citizens, or rather who were brought to the United States as children, got into trouble, ended up serving sentences, and then being deported back to their countries of origin, so to speak, even though they'd never set foot a day in their lives in that country. That led to more gang activity, which led to more crime, which led to governments being unable to handle said crime, which led to crises of populations surging towards the border for their very, running for their very lives and trying to get a human existence in the United States. So it becomes this kind of weird Mondrian loop where we kind of solved a problem. We haven't really addressed it that much.
Yeah.
President Biden has put Kamala Harris in charge of that, but no action really seems to be taking place. And in face of all this opposition towards some kind of reform, we're going to have this problem, and it's not going to go away anytime soon.
Joseph, we have a situation right now where some children are working up to 12 hours a day, according to this report in the New York Times. They're basically trapped in circumstances that are beyond their control. I mean, there are even children who attend school, and as soon as school shuts down for the day, they rush off to these jobs where they work late into the evening. Alan was telling us a moment ago that the federal government can't be everywhere at the same time. It depends on people like us as well. But is there anything to the fact that the federal government lacks the will, or maybe looking the other way while this is taking place?
Well, since the Times report came out, there's been vowed crackdowns. People in Congress and the White House have all said that they're going to try to stop this from happening. But you do have a problem where the government is looking the other way, mainly because there's a profit motive involved here. We can't say that they're actively looking the other way, but certainly they don't have the resources to crack down on this in any kind of meaningful way. The fines that are levied against these companies are basically operating costs that they're dealing with. And you have states that are working to reduce the barriers to child labor. And it's not like these are paper routes or anything. So you have governments at the state level, you have a federal government that's not, if it's not looking the other way, it certainly is unable to crack down on in any meaningful way or levy fines with any teeth. Therefore, we don't have a situation where even consumers being conscious of where products are coming from really can't put a dent in this problem because it's so widespread and so pervasive, and we can't get at the root cause.
Rafael, you were telling us a moment ago about this task force that's been set up by the Department of Health and Human Services. What exactly will the task force do?
Yeah, so again, I think that'll be one of the main responsibilities for that task force will be to, take a closer look at the current processes that are in place. I think they've announced kind of an audit of the way that they do the vetting process for the sponsors. So whenever a child arrives in the United States, they are then put into the care of a qualifying sponsor. Oftentimes, that's the preference is to be a relative, and so the department announced kind of an audit of that system to ensure that they're doing that in the best way and the most efficient way possible as well. But also, to increase communications with all the different departments that kind of handle the well-being of children once they arrive in the United States. And, if there are certain kind of red flags that kind of come up, ensuring that those are being communicated throughout the entire system so it doesn't kind of get lost in translation or fall into cracks.
Brian, the Secretary for the Department of Homeland Security, Alejandro Mayorkas, he says undocumented workers, like these children, are doing jobs that U.S. citizens are unwilling to do or refusing to do. Let's listen to some of what he had to say on this.
I've engaged extensively with the business community. There are 10 million open jobs. There's a clamoring for individuals to fill them that domestic workers do not.
So, Brian, here we have a situation where, as he says, this is a case where there are millions of jobs that U.S. citizens are not willing to fulfill. Why not legalize the status of those who are willing to do those jobs?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, there's 13 or 14 million undocumented workers in the United States. They go to work every day, they pay taxes, but they have to live in the shadows. They have to live in the sort of an environment of constant terror. You get stopped at a stop sign, stopped at a red light. Your kids come home and you're gone. I mean, this kind of terror also deprives workers of the ability to join unions and to struggle and to launch complaints when there's unfair labor practices going on. The need to legalize the workforce, unions need it because it means wages will go up. If undocumented workers have rights, That means their wages will go up because they can join unions. This is very, very important. There's another element that I want to address that some of the other guests touched on. You know, the U.S. government has a lot of prosecutorial power. They have Julian Assange still sort of in extradition, locked up. Why not take some of the CEOs of companies that are super exploiting children and meatpacking companies and put them in jail, arrest them, charge them? I mean, the Packard company that just was, fined $1.5 million, $1.5 million, that's it, for employing 10 children, young kids in meatpacking industries. I mean, if you hold CEOs and white-collar criminals to the same standard that all the other people who are arrested, that would have a very strong deterrent impact. This is a crime of convenience and opportunity. So yes, legalize the undocumented, provide those who are here green cards or the ability to stay here legally, not to live in fear, the right to join unions, the need to strengthen unions, but the right or the need of the federal government and state governments to use the power of prosecution against these terrible criminal acts being conducted against young children for the sake of profit. These are the things the U.S. government could do. It has a lot of power, but we use that power all over the world. But what about these criminals at home running corporations, carrying out criminal activity against kids?
Alan, Brian poses some interesting questions there. Why not prosecute CEOs, put them in prison if necessary? Wouldn't that be a deterrent?
I think so. It's the same reason we didn't put a lot of bankers in prison when we had a lot of the markets crash, right? So I think, it's somewhat preserving the market. I think this Department of Justice will go after some people eventually, but not at first take, because the concept will be then you're shutting down the food supply that we currently have in the United States. So it's sort of a very rock and a hard space that these employers find themselves in, because if the government were to allow the workers to sort of meet the need, then they wouldn't be in this situation, which led to the staffing companies, right? So there are a lot of things such as payroll, Social Security, government systems that they could sort of work together to figure out these things. But we don't have this big, gigantic government that's sort of sorting through all these processes, because along with that, probably closer to 20 million people who are undocumented, the situation at the southern border. We also have people who are flying into the country and applying for asylum, or also child labor that's coming in from China and other places. So we should be aware that it's not just the southern border children that are having this situation, it's children and immigrants in general. And by making sure that we can see people, one, we address the security need, and two, we address the workforce issues that your previous guest spoke about by making sure we have appropriate wages and that we have a strong union.
Yeah, there's another complication here in the United States, Alan, and that is, of course, this country is made up of 50 states, and those 50 states are allowed to pass their own legislation concerning labor. I mean, we had a situation today, Wednesday, where the governor of the state of Arkansas, Sarah Huckabee, signed legislation that will basically loosen a lot of the protections and controls that existed in that state for children. But that could happen from state to state. But I mean, are the federal laws, which will cover all states, strong enough to protect workers?
I think what the governor did today in Arizona was a misstep. I mean, in Arkansas was a misstep, and she should have immediately corrected that, because she's saying it was a barrier to people working by making sure you had the permission of the parents. So it doesn't really speak to the time, but it shows you where someone's interest is. And when you see that, believe it. And what's important about this story is now that every American is aware that this is happening. And so what are we going to do about it? And call ourselves this great free nation that doesn't take advantage of children when it's in plain sight in all the places that were easily available to find.
Rafael, according to official numbers, in the past 2 years, more than 250,000 unaccompanied children crossed the border. Parents are sending their children across the border by themselves because they're treated differently. How are they treated differently, and why are they treated differently?
Yeah, so I think there's a role in place called Title 42 that has allowed U.S. border officials to expel people immediately back across the border into Mexico. But because a lot of these restrictions don't apply to children, and so the U.S. essentially will take in children. They will not deport them or send them back, and so that sort of creates a situation where if a family is being turned away, after they might have to have that conversation where they might decide that and since the whole family can't make it, then they might just send the child by themselves. And there's been many instances of that happening currently under this policy, Title 42. But even when that goes away, which is expected to happen in May, there's concern that under some of the proposed guidelines that President Biden administrations has announced with regards to asylum, that could also create a situation where there's a lot of families that may be disqualified, or at least the parents may be disqualified from seeking asylum, but that then could create, a situation where they might decide, or they might opt to send their child by themselves as well.
Joseph, this is clearly, a problem which has no easy solutions, because in many cases we know that the children who are working here in the United States, and as I said, they work under very harsh conditions sometimes, they send some of that money back to their parents where they come from. The Biden administration announced, I think it was about a year ago, that they were going to make investments in Central America, where a lot of the immigrants come from, to create opportunities there. Whatever happened to that?
It's a very good question. We know that Kamala Harris, Vice President, made a couple of trips to Central America. She talked a lot about having U.S. investment and trying to stem the problem right at the root rather than deal with it at the border. But it's really a tough nut to crack. I mean, there's got to be some investment, but as much as they're willing to invest, it's never going to be enough, because we're talking about decades of exploitation. We're talking about decades of U.S. meddling in Central American affairs, and that's not going to be reversed overnight, and it probably isn't going to be reversed no matter how much money they spend, because there's no infrastructure there to make sure that these problems get reversed, or the infrastructure there is so wobbly and or corrupt that it's difficult to make sure that these changes happen in a meaningful way.
Alan, how does the sponsorship system work? Because there are reports that some of these sponsors, they take in multiple children, children work, and then they have to split some of their earnings with the sponsors.
Sure. So let me address a couple of issues in one space. One, I don't believe that the vice president is the border czar. No vice president in the history of this country has ever been with regards to such a complicated situation that even presidents haven't been able to handle. I think that's unfair.
Right.
I also know, in fact, that the vice president has received close to $3 billion worth of investment with regards to the border, that was also celebrated at the North American sort of a rally that happened in Los Angeles earlier this year. So we should also know that this is a regional issue that needs to be addressed by Central America and North America as a whole, and Canada is accepting some immigrants.
Yeah.
With regards to the sponsors and the situation that's happening, and even with the new parole program.
Very quickly, Alan, I'm running out of time.
Used for the Ukrainians, that it's difficult to say exactly how much money is with regards to having them, but the government is vetting those applications.
Okay.
Of course, it's just paper.
All right, I'm afraid that's where we have to leave it. We have run out of time. Thank you to everyone for being with us. That's it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Arnold Knight in Washington, D.C.